Hello, everybody, and thank you to ITF for the invitation to make this brief presentation. Brian and others in the previous session gave a very good explanation of, and with great clarity, of the impact of COVID on the air transport industry. I've been asked to focus in particular on the competition implications for airlines. And what I hope to show is that while the impact has, of course, been substantial, it's not unique. And by that, what I mean is that it has actually just added to pressures in the industry that have been around for some time, for at least a decade, and which were causing increasing concern to those of us who favoured the liberalisation of air transport services. I should add at the beginning that I'm a firm believer that liberalisation of international aviation is a good thing. It's a good thing for the industry, it's a good thing for governments, and it's particularly good for the consumer. So anything that limits that trend is by definition a bad thing. So what I need to do is to give a bit of history as to where we've got to today. Because to understand where we're going in the future, we need to understand where we are now and how we got there. And I make no apology for the history. Much of it will be familiar to you, I'm sure, but I'll try and go through it very quickly. But I do believe it's important to understand what the problems are. I should also apologize, there's a small problem on the next two slides, which I haven't been able to correct. So just ignore what it says in the middle of the slide for the moment. We need to go back to the Chicago Convention over 70 years ago, which set the basis for the whole regulation of international aviation, and which fundamentally still applies to this day. It was, of course, a great success, especially in relation to safety regulation, and more recently with respect to security and arguably the environment. But it failed in that although it created a general outline for the economic regulation of international air transport, it did not provide the detail that was needed. And in particular, it failed to establish a multilateral regime to guide governments going forward. So instead, of course, we had a regime characterized by bilateral air service agreements negotiated between sovereign states, whereby nothing could happen without the specific approval of the two governments concerned. And this approach, especially given the structure of the industry at the time, was certainly bound to lead to a lack of competition. It was a regime where producer interests prevailed over those of consumers, and where collusion between airlines was not only tolerated, it was actually required in many instances. And the result of all this was very predictable. It created an industry that was inefficient. It had high costs and therefore high tariffs. With high fares, it had reduced demand. It was essentially an industry catering for the better off. And it was an industry that incurred enormous financial losses. An industry that essentially around the world had to be supported by governments. So from a regulatory perspective, what we've witnessed in the 70 years since then has been the gradual dismantling of those restrictions and the creation of a far more competitive environment. Now, that's not universally true, but it's a clear trend. And it's important not to understate that the enormous, what has been gained, the enormous steps forward that have been made during that period. And in particular, the industry is nowadays has far less direct government involvement and far more focus on the interests of the consumer than it did in its earlier years. Doesn't mean to say it's not still regulated, that it is regulated in an economic sense, as regulated as it ever was. It's just that it's regulated in a different way now. Instead of governments dictating what airlines should do directly, the focus of attention is much more on protecting the consumer and advancing competition. And this has been achieved over the decades by a series of substantial disruptions, each of which has had a dramatic impact and has fundamentally changed the sector's structure. And those disruptions were, first of all, technology. The technology in the early years in particular was successful in overriding the fundamental inefficiency of the airline industry, and therefore contributed substantially to reducing costs. We saw in one of Brian's slides earlier that following the introduction of jet aircraft, the reduction in unit costs for the airline sector was substantial, far greater than that achieved by later deregulatory developments. So that was the first disruption, and of course technology continues to this day to disrupt the industry. The second disruption was charter services. I think it's easy to forget nowadays how significant charter services were, especially in Europe in the 50s and 60s and partly into the 70s. The development of the inclusive tour charter had a dramatic impact on air services and forced the legacy airlines to adapt. Charters were lucky in a way that they had crept under the radar, had not been fully covered by the regulatory regime. And although there were restrictions on their operations, their flexibility made it possible for them to have quite a significant impact. The major government disruption came, of course, initially with US deregulation, which overnight transformed the US domestic market and had two major outcomes. One was the development on a national scale of what we now recognize as a low-cost carriers, and that had an impact around the world. And secondly, US deregulation was an example to be followed by other countries who saw the benefits. And those other countries, many of them were not slow to follow. And in particular, of course, we have EU liberalization, which was slower, but in the end achieved a similar outcome. But these two developments, EU, US, and elsewhere, were essentially domestic or regional liberalizations. International liberalization came with the open skies regimes, which have, again, a spread around the world. So there's no doubt that this regulatory reform, this trend, has been a major success. But there's been winners and losers, but there's no end of academic studies identifying the benefits for all of the stakeholders from these developments. But it has had its limitations, and in particular, the airline industry has not been what I would describe as normalized. It remains special in many ways. Now, most industries regard themselves as special, but the airline industry is particularly so. And perhaps the most critical factor there, I would argue, is the continued involvement of governments, much more so than in most other industries. There's an absence of truly global airlines, despite the fact that airlines, or most airlines, are international, and the industry is international by character. There is not a single truly global airline in the same way that other industries have produced global companies. And the reason for that is the archaic ownership and control rules, which still affect airline consolidation. So what we've had is not true full deregulation. The result has been a financially unsustainable industry. You have to remember that the airline industry has destroyed more capital than it has created since the Wright brothers. IATA produced figures before the COVID epidemic at a time, of course, of some prosperity for the airline industry. Figures that showed that only 30 airlines in the world could be regarded as truly profitable. Only 30 airlines earned their cost of capital. It's an industry that has traditionally had to rely on bailouts. So from that extent, to that extent, the COVID experience is not unusual in principle. Those bailouts, of course, have come either directly from governments or from various forms of bankruptcy protection. There are jokes, of course, around the financial sustainability of airlines. I'm sure you've all heard them. My old boss is often ascribed to having said that if you want to be a millionaire, you just start with $1 billion and form an airline. He actually, as an aside, he actually didn't say that, or at least he didn't say it originally. I actually put it in a speech for him, and I stole it from somebody else, but it's always ascribed to Richard Branson these days. But this doesn't have to be like this. US experience has shown what can be achieved. There are some who argue, some academics who argue, that airlines could never be profitable. They suffer from what's known as the empty core problem. But more realistically, I believe the answer lies in the consolidation of the industry, and the US experience has highlighted why that should be so. The US airlines were for many years complete basket cases. They lost more money than any other airlines in the world for some time. They were then allowed to consolidate quite substantially. And what happened was that they were transformed from incurring major losses to being the most profitable airlines in the world in a very short period of time. And the only serious explanation, I mean, there may be a number of factors that led into that, but the overwhelming factor was that they were allowed to consolidate. They were allowed to gain more market power and therefore more control over their pricing, and that led to higher fares and more profit. Now, you might argue that that's not in the consumer interest, but if you're dealing with an industry that has been permanently loss-making over many decades, you have to question whether the level of fares is set at, under the current regime, is set at the right level. So that ends my history lesson, you'll be glad to hear. So we move on to the problem is how to get the rest of the world to follow the example that's set in the US. And of course, the major factor is to reform the ownership and control rules. It's evident that the economic regulatory reform had essentially ground to a halt following the EU-US negotiations for a transatlantic agreement, what somebody has called creeping Bermudaism, to a reference to the UK-US Bermuda Agreement, which was seen as a backward step in international regulation. The problems are very, very clear. There's no clear way forward to reform the ownership and control rules. The EU-US negotiations were seen as a way out of this, because to reform ownership and control, you cannot do it bilaterally. You have to have a multilateral approach. Two countries alone cannot do this. And the EU-US at the time would have accounted for some 60% of international scheduled air services, and could have set a pattern, could have created a momentum that would have led the whole industry into a new and more prosperous future. That failed, of course, and since then there's been no obvious way forward. Even IATA, which previously had supported changes to the ownership and control rules, has now backpedaled and is less enthusiastic. And no individual government or even group of governments seem to be taking this forward. The second problem is that after this trend towards an ever more liberal and competitive industry, there's been a general reaction against globalization, not restricted to the aviation industry, but more generally. The nation state, the very core of the Chicago regulatory regime, has re-emerged as a more acceptable concept, especially in trade, international trade. It's even been argued that we may be about to enter an era of deglobalization, and aviation can't be immune from this trend and will inevitably be negatively affected. Over the past century, it's worth noting that every major global downturn has been associated with a rise in discrimination against foreign commercial interests. The first wave of globalization, which started in the 1870s, came to an end with the First World War. And the second wave, starting at the turn of the 21st century, may well have been ended by COVID, if it wasn't already dead. So that aviation, as I say, can't be immune from that and is bound to be affected. And the third factor was the expansion of the Gulf carriers. There's nothing unusual about the success of the Gulf carriers. In fact, what they did had been previously done by other airlines in previous decades. Singapore Airlines, for example, KLM is another example. But what did happen was significant opposition and lobbying from a number of legacy airlines. First in Europe, where there was an intense debate and different views. And then as the Gulf carriers expanded their route networks, opposition emerged in the United States. I don't want to obviously get into the rights and wrongs of that, but the one impact of that was that it added to the general feeling, the general concept that perhaps liberalization, deregulation had gone far enough, and it added to the pressure to at least stop and potentially even to go backwards and introduce more protectionism. It added to the general environment. So this is the background to the arrival of the COVID-19 epidemic. What we have is a financially weak airline sector, despite recent relatively good performance. And needless to say, when the COVID arrived, it was the weakest carriers that were the most affected, weakest financially. What we also have is continued regulatory restrictions limiting the creation of a financially sustainable satisfactory, and notably the restrictions on cross-border mergers and takeovers. And finally, the absence of a will to seek further reform, not universal by any means, of course, but a growing consensus almost that reform may have gone far enough, and maybe even it's time for a return to elements of protectionism, which is a worrying concern, I would suggest. On top of all this comes the impact of COVID, which, as Brian outlined earlier, has resulted in massive financial losses and increased government involvement. The problem isn't so much that the governments have had to step in to save airlines. They did the same for many other businesses, some of which were of far less strategic and political value than airlines. The problem is a combination of the competitive distortion created by the way in which help has been provided and the effect of the inevitable increase in government involvement in airline operations. And I'll just expand on those a little bit. We saw earlier that government aid has taken numerous forms. There's been direct grants, there have been loans, equity purchases, waivers of fees and taxes, even renationalization in some cases. Countries have, of course, reacted in different ways, some providing substantial aid, others adopting a more laissez-faire approach. The impact of the epidemic and the rate of recovery has varied significantly between countries, and that in itself creates problems for relative competition going forward. And finally, it's inevitable that post-COVID, competition between airlines will be affected. Those airlines, and there's a risk of a split between the haves and the have-nots among airlines. Those airlines that have been fortunate in having a high proportion of grants, for example, or perhaps have increased their government shareholdings, will be in a stronger position than airlines that have had to rely on loans, which will have to be paid back. All of this creates problems for the future. There's increased financial instability, inevitably. There'll be more bankruptcies and incidentally more new entrants as well. Airlines will have to strengthen their financial balance sheets, including repaying loans, but not all airlines, and that creates inequality. There's a distortion of competition. Airlines with grants, as I said, will be in a much stronger position going forward. Then there's increased government involvement, and history has shown. I don't want to be rude to the government participants in this meeting, but I would suggest to you that history has shown that governments are not good at either running airlines or getting involved in them. Even when they're not directly involved, the increased financial commitment that they've entered into will inevitably influence the way in which they view the industry. It seems inevitable that governments will seek to protect their investments, to seek to recoup their money, and that is not going to encourage them to continue to seek further liberalization of the sector. I'd suggest that there's already some evidence of this emerging. I'll just give one example. We saw in Austria where the bailout of Austrian Airlines was accompanied by the proposal of a minimum airfare set at €40 just happened to be slightly above the average fare charged by Ryanair and Wizz International. Designed, it has been alleged, to protect the flag carrier Austrian Airlines. Also part of the package was a reform of the ticket taxation to increase taxes on short-haul services, but decrease them on longer haul. Again, arguably designed to protect the flag carrier, in which the government now had an increased financial involvement. Now, there will be other examples like that, without a doubt, going forward. So overall, it seems to me that any prospect of normalizing the airline industry, treating it, creating a sector more similar to other sectors, other businesses, is as far away as ever. And it's really rather difficult in those circumstances, I would suggest, to be optimistic about the short or medium or even the longer term prospects for the industry. This creates serious issues for going forward, which governments and the industry needs to address. That's the sum of what I wanted to say. I was also asked to say something on slots, but it seemed to me slots are slightly different from the core argument here. I have prepared an addendum, but unless you want me to, I will skip over that, and if necessary, I can come back to it.